sure we get through it all.
Thank you, sir.
So, good morning. It's Tuesday, January 16th, and this is the Senate Agricultural Committee meeting. And we have Alan Keel with us this morning to talk about New England, feeding New England, which is a real great subject. And so welcome, Ellen, and we'll introduce ourselves. As I said, Irene has got to be away for a little bit, introducing a couple of her bills to other committees. And Richie, Senator Weston, should be right along. So.
Yeah, Brian Collmore, representing Rutland.
Brian Gappian, Bennington.
And Bobby Starr from Orleans County. So welcome, and we'll turn it over to you. And I don't know if we have questions as we go along, we'll just ask them.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, thanks so much.
yeah, well,
For the record, Ellen Kaler, Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund. Hello, Senator.
How are you?
Good, how are you?
It's good to see you.
You too. And so yes, today I'm here to share a little bit about a project that I've been working on for a number of years. And the project itself, that the report we'll be going over today, is called New England Feeding New England, a regional approach to food system resilience. And this is some research that came out in June of last year. And I remember Senator Starr, when Senator Pearson was still in the Senate, we talked about getting this project up and running and starting some research, because he was asking the question about, why can't I go to a grocery store and just know that lettuce and carrots and meat and everything is from Vermont? Like, why is it so difficult? So, and I remember I said to him, just wait. We're going to be getting into that a lot more, and we'll be explaining what's up. So I'm going to walk us through this body of work. I have PowerPoint slides that'll help elucidate the various data and graphics that we put together. And then happy to take questions as we go along. We have 2 hours, so we can keep this fairly spacious. I know Abby Willard from the agency is going to come over at some point soon. I would love for her to have a few minutes to share how the agency thinks about this, because they've been very active in all of this work as well.
So this will separate, the goal is to separate Vermont products from others, or
No.
at least delineate?
No, the overall purpose of this is to set a regional goal of seeing if we can get to 30% regional production and consumption by 2030. So across the 6 New England states, could we actually produce 30% of the food that we eat and actually eat that 30%, right? We actually produce, and you'll see in my presentation, we produce in some products far more than we eat, like dairy, and we produce far less of what we eat in terms of proteins and
So
other
the
things.
focus of this is to do that, not to separate out.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes. So this is very much building upon everything we've been doing for the last 14 years with Vermont Farm to Plate. And I remember very well back when Farm to Plate first really got launched, and we released the first plan in 2011, and then Secretary Chuck Ross said, well, you know, local's all good, but we've got to get into regional markets with our food. And I was like, I totally agree. And a lot of our producers aren't ready for that, and the markets aren't ready for that. So we need to build towards it. So this body of work is intended to help show what is actually possible in New England when it comes to doing more to really secure the food supply, because that's a big part of what we need to be doing as we think about climate change, as we think about the disruptions in the supply chains that we've experienced. What could we actually do? Okay, so that's a big part of what we're
as a region.
As a 6-state region, yes.
And I guess we already know that Maine and Vermont have quite a lot of open spaces to grow food, so
So we'll get through it.
Mass and some of the other states are a little tighter.
Exactly. So we'll go through these. I just want to give you a little background about where this all comes from. So since 2012, 2013, I've been part of what is now known as the New England Food System Planners Partnership. It's a group of organizations like the Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund in the New England states who are doing some kind of food system planning like we're doing with Vermont Farm to Plate. And we're also part of a regional effort called Food Solutions New England, which is a regional network of about 25,000 people who are also really interested in food system development in the region.
Mr. Chair, ask a quick question. Just, I'm sorry if you've already said this. Where are we right now with the percentage, and when do we supposed to reach even 30%? Just to go back. You're getting there.
I'm gonna get there,
Perfect.
but I will remind you that like as a starting point, in Vermont,
Yeah.
when we did the local food counts in 2020, we were at 16.1%.
Okay.
But when I go through the slides, I'll help you understand where roughly I think we're at.
Okay.
The researchers think we're at, but we won't actually know more definitively until April or May, because for the first time ever, we've got the other 5 New England states doing a local food count like we've been doing it in Vermont since
great.
2011. So it's literally underway right now. Data is being collected as we speak, and we'll have that number because we need that as the baseline to then be able to know, like, are we gonna get there? So back in April, we added representatives from each of the state departments of agriculture in the 6 states. So Abby Willard has now joined this group. We meet monthly and we're working collaboratively. So all of the other state departments of agriculture have a representative as part of this initiative. So here's the project goal, that by 2030, 30% of the food consumed in New England is produced, harvested, caught within New England. And that's it's a big audacious goal, really. So the project timeline, we started doing the research back in the fall of 2021. We released the report in June of 2023 at the NIASDA conference in New Hampshire with all of the Department of Ag commissioners from across the Northeast. They gave us an hour on their agenda and we publicly released this body of work at that time, which was great. And now we're working on collaborating with our partners to implement and move this project along. So what did we actually produce? Well, we actually produced 7 components of this report. I've given you the executive summary only, and that's, but I'll be pulling slides from this other parts as well. And I gave to Linda the links, and she is going to have all 7 up on your web page if you want to dig into any of them. The core of them are, it's actually, so the executive summary covers a good bit of what goes into this, but each of the other documents goes in, it dives in quite deep to everything that's in this body of research. We also then this fall published 6 state-specific reports, and I've given you the one for Vermont. So what we did was we took the data that was regionally developed and we said, okay, let's pull out the state-specific pieces, and then we publish these state-specific reports, which we're finding to be very useful when we have these kinds of conversations, especially with state legislatures and such. So what did we pull together? We actually pulled together a research team of 16 folks. We had 4 folks that were served as team leads. So we broke into 4 teams. We had a dietary patterns team that was chaired by Brian Donahue, who helped develop the original New England food vision of 60% by 2050. And that came out in 2014. And then Chris Peters, who is new to Vermont, but he comes from Tufts, and he joined the USDA ARS system, and he's based at UVM now as part of the Food Systems Research Unit. He is tremendous, and he headed up the production team. Nick Rockler did the economic impact assessment of the region, something that had never been done before. And you may know him as the counterpart to Tom Cavett, your JFO economist. And then Holly Fowler, who was the market channel team lead, she has a consulting business called Northbound Ventures, but has done a lot of food system work, worked for 10 years for Sodexo. And then a number of other researchers across the region from the other states. We had some other UVM students, researchers that were part of this as well. We covered fisheries, we covered land-based agriculture, we covered nutrition. So it was a pretty comprehensive, amazing group of people to be coordinating, and I served as the primary coordinator for all of that work. We also had an advisory committee, again, to double check and make sure that we were thinking through things appropriately. Molly Anderson's at Middlebury College, for instance. Jacob Park has been at Castleton. Folks from Harvard, folks from University of Maine. Rachel Chapman used to be at UVM, and then we lost her to Maine. Laura Ginsberg from the agency was there. So a really amazing group of people. Also was on an advisory committee. So now I'm gonna go ahead and get into what we found, because what we really wanted to do with this research was to answer the question, what will it really take to grow, raise, produce, harvest, and catch more of the regional food and move it through a complex supply chain to our homes and other places that we eat? So how might increasing and escalating impacts of climate change impact our ability to feed ourselves? And what can we do as a region to make our food more equitable and fair, resilient, and reliable? So here is just some very, very high level. I'm going to go into this in much more detail, but just to give you the quick snapshot of what we came, sort of the top line takeaway from each of the main 4 volumes. In volume 1, where we looked at dietary eating patterns, if we ate healthier in a more resilient way, could more of our food be supplied by regional production? And we looked at what a caloric intake would need to be, and servings, and the types of food that we would eat if we were eating in a more resilient, closer to home kind of way based on what we can produce in the region. In volume 2, we looked at could the 6 New England states meet a goal of supplying 30% of the region's food? So what are we actually producing now? What would we need to produce? And producing now, we have 15.3 million people across the 6 New England states. In 2030, we're projected to 15.3 million. We're projected to go to 15.6 million by 2030. So what would it take to feed more of us with more regionally produced food, and how many acres would be required to do that? In volume 3, we took a look at do we have the right mix of industries to ramp up food production? What's the size of the food system in New England? How many jobs? How much in sales? What's the multiplier of the food system? Looked at all those kinds of things. And then in volume 4, we looked at what are the market channels that create the best opportunities for sourcing local and regional food products. Who's currently selling local and regional food in the region by different market channels, whether it's grocery, restaurants, institutions, direct, those kinds of channels. And what would it really take for those channels to shift in order to enable consumers to actually acquire more regional and local food, right?
To get it distributed.
Exactly. So one of the things that we did was we created this Common Food System Challenges backgrounder. I'm not going to go into a lot of the detail on this, but just to say, for those folks that might be interested, we took a look across the whole U.S. food system and identified these 7 challenges that really do exist for everybody. There's a lack of planning for a long-term food supply. There's no one that's really in charge of that nationally. Like the USDA keeps tabs on what is happening, but they're not tasked with make more food for us in the US, right? There are risks to long-term food production because of climate change and other food concentrations. There's challenges to farms, fisheries, and food business viability. Because of concentration, it makes it harder for family farms and smaller locally owned and regionally owned distributors and stores to make it against an ever more consolidating agribusiness industry. There's
Do other states have viability programs like we have?
Some, but not as much as we would like, and that's, the DHCD has been doing a lot to try to strengthen and try to get more funding from the USDA into the farm bill so that it can support more farm viability programs in other states. We have the best in the country, there's no doubt about that. And there's some in New England that have some, but it needs to be strengthened by a lot.
Well, we've been at it.
We've been at it a long
for a
time,
while.
yeah, definitely. So you can see here other things that are impacting across the food system challenges, progress in reducing diet-related health problems, reducing nutrition and food insecurity, and we waste an awful lot of the food that is available for consumption, just, on our plates, portion size at restaurants that don't come home with people, those kinds of things that we could make more of what we're producing go farther if we were more mindful about what we were actually eating. So just to give you a couple of highlights then about like the magnitude of what we're talking about on the climate risk side of things. This was a graphic that was actually produced a couple of years ago and showed up at the New York Times, but it just gives you the sense of the country, right? Sort of where are there challenges that the changing climate and the weather patterns, what's happening? So you've got the wildfires in the West, as we know, and water stress in the West. There's drought throughout the West. There's extreme heat in the middle part of the country. There's more extreme rainfall that's happening up and down the East Coast. There's bigger and more impactful hurricanes along the eastern coast line. All of these things have an impact then on our agricultural production and the physical movement of food. You think about in the port of Los Angeles, down the very bottom there of California, the vast majority of the food that's entering this country from other places comes through there. When you take a look at where we live up in Vermont, we're kind of towards the end of the supply chain in a lot of ways, in the trucking distribution routes. So the big question that we were really sitting with was, what more could we be doing in New England to really take care of ourselves more with our overall food supply? Yeah.
Just go back for a
Yeah.
second. What is the blue?
That is
it's so
extreme,
small I
sorry,
can't.
that's extreme rainfall.
A rainfall, and then
Yeah.
the green is,
The green is hurricanes.
Oh.
And the purple is sea level rise. Just more impact.
so most of New England is facing more rain than.
Yeah, so this one here shows it a little bit better. So,
And when you have a second, you mind just going back?
sure,
Just back to Senator Collmore's question. So the purple you said is the
is sea level rise.
sea level rise. And so I'm not seeing it in New England.
No, it's in the
Let's see.
left.
It's a little hard to see. It'll show up in this next
Okay,
one better.
thank you.
So for instance, sea level rise is this one to the right there. So you can see all along the coastline of New England, there is a high to medium and in some cases low, but primarily medium to high level risk. So when you also think about this in terms of that sea level rise putting pressure on the folks that live along the coast, that's going to put even more upward migration pressure than on northern New England as populations start to migrate because the coastal areas become less able to support the populations that it has in the past.
So is it a rising and falling situation?
No, it's actually considered sea level like total rise. So part of it is when there's storm surge from more hurricanes, but some of it is actually just sea level rise because of because it's largely because of the loss of glaciers and losing of the Greenland ice sheet, Antarctic Great Ice sheet, and the Arctic. All of that, as those icebergs melt, it's not like they disappear. They become ocean, and that just is rising the overall levels of water in the ocean.
Plus all the rain.
Yes.
If we get a couple of inches more rain or 3 more than normal, it's gotta go somewhere.
So you can see here that extreme rainfall on the far left, top left here. We experienced that this summer with the floods, right? We've experienced whether it's extreme snowfall with various or wet snow. Those are all projected. We have water stress down at the bottom in Maine, which is a problem because and heat stress because there's a lot of agricultural production that happens in Maine, for instance. So we just were trying to, again, based on the science, based on what's come out of looking at our region, what are our risks? In Vermont specifically, dialing it in just a little bit more closely, you can see which counties are at higher risk for things like extreme rain, obviously hurricanes very little. It's really when we get these big nor'easters that come up through that Windham County might face a little bit. A medium level of water stress, what we're seeing is more like swings in drought and then extreme rain, right? And then we have experienced heat stress in terms of lack of, there are some periods where we're getting, hello, Abby. We are getting higher temperatures during the summer months that put a lot more strain and stress on things that are growing. So obviously we don't have sea level rise. We're the only ones in New England that are safe from that. The other part that we looked into was food access in Vermont. So right now I'm just looking at the high level overview here. There are certain counties where, in certain towns where there is higher degrees, disproportionately low income folks who have low access to places where they can obtain food. So this is a national, I think it's USDA designation, where a large proportion of residents have low incomes and are more than a half a mile from a food source for urban populations, and over 10,000 miles, over 10 miles for rural populations. So if you're 10 miles from a food source, store, or restaurant, then that means that you have low access to food. Now, here in Vermont, 10 miles in our rural states. So, because you may have a car that's not working so well, you know, and if you really had to get to a food source, it could be very challenging. So this LILA data is looking at low income by census tract, and then where you have low access to food sources. So you can see that in certain parts of the Northeast Kingdom, some parts in Rutland County, down in Windsor, Windham, and Bennington counties, definitely in certain Burlington, a little bit in Franklin County, there are areas where it can be difficult for people to have easy access to food when they need it. They're not producing it themselves. When you factor in race, if you are African American, Latino, Asian, Native American, it can be even harder because of even lower income levels to be able to access food as you need to. And it tends to be more the case that that BIPOC folks tend to live in places that have lower access to food.
I thought though in Vermont, most towns were set up between 5 and 10 miles from each other. So,
and I think that it's inherent in the way that this the data looks, the different colors, for instance. We're not as bad off as a lot of other states, and especially other states in New England are, because of that, right? But for instance, and we'll get into this in a little while, looking at different types of stores, what might exist in some of these more rural areas is a Dollar Tree or a Dollar General, which has very little fresh, if any, fresh food, right? And only has shelf-stable packaged, high caloric type foods that are also quite unhealthy for people. So some of this is also gets to, well, what is the nature of the stores and the nature of the food that is available in a given region, and is it sufficient for the population? So that also factors in. The flip side of that is in the growing season, of course, We also have a lot of folks that are growing a chunk of their own, a good bit of their own food. But in the wintertime, that's obviously more challenging. So next week, my colleagues will be in talking about the food security roadmap to ending hunger in Vermont by 2035. So we're on the schedule for next week to talk about that. And that's in part a response to this kind of awareness and understanding of the challenges of food insecurity and hunger in the state and where it shows up and what are some of the strategies to address that. Just as a touch point of where we're at with food insecurity in the state, we pre-pandemic, and coming out of the last recession, we were at a high of 13.6%. That dropped because of the response we had to COVID of providing additional SNAP benefits and having Vermont Everyone Eats and the types of programs that we put in place as a public policy and as a priority of what we put our funding towards. We were able to bring down food insecurity by a lot. And now that's starting to tick back up as the long-term additional SNAP program funding goes away. So it's one of those things that it shows that when we want to actually do this, meaning reduce food insecurity, we actually have a lot of the tools, and a lot of it boils down to money. We looked at median hourly wages for selected occupations. This is actually in 2022. So we looked at, these are actually Vermont numbers. So it looked at what is our livable wage in Vermont as of 2022, the last data, what are the different occupational titles. So you can see that a lot of the jobs within the food system do not pay a livable wage. And so oftentimes what I find I'm up against is people are like, well, then we shouldn't be investing in food system jobs. It's like, no, we should be working to improve the economic viability of farms and food businesses so that they can afford to pay better. And we should be prioritizing how do we support food system workers to be able to have the types of pay and benefits that allow them to thrive, just like in other sectors. Because it's not like we can't eat, like we need food. So, and then we also touched on a little bit on waste in our landfills. This data is pre the 2020 going to household collection of food scraps, but I'm not going to spend any time on this, but just to know that it's in there. So now I'm actually going to jump to volume 3, which you don't have in front of you, which is to give you a sense of the economic impact. How big is New England's food system? Well, it's actually quite big. It's about $190 billion in sales across the 6 states. $190 billion in sales. So that represents quite a large market for producers. And in Vermont, our sales, our economic impact is about 14 million. So we're very small comparatively, but you can see how the food system continues to expand over time. And you can see here a lot of what makes that up is wholesale distribution and then retail distribution, then food service. And the actual amount of food production, manufacturing, agricultural, and fisheries portion of that is actually relatively small, which really speaks to all the added costs that get applied to food that is produced. And then by the time it's sold, to the point where you're catching the sales numbers, how much activity has taken place.
190 is all sales.
Yes, 190 billion, yeah. The food system also employs a lot of people, almost a million people. These are 2017 data, so when we get the 2022 economic census data out, we'll be able to update this. But you can see that the vast majority are in food services, which again relates to lower paying, and also in retail trade. And the actual number of folks that are actually producing the food is actually not that large compared to all of the people that are employed, moving food around, selling food, relating to it in some other way. Yeah.
since you've run through this so fast and.
Sorry,
No, that's fine.
slow me down.
The
It's okay.
30% number that
Yes.
you're getting
Yes.
is 30% consumed here.
Correct. In the region.
So how much, I get no relationship to how much we export.
Correct.
Must be, there must be a lot of people, stuff coming out of their fisheries that go across the country.
Correct.
Our dairy products end up going to New York, New Jersey.
Correct.
I get no sense of what that 30% is in relation to that.
Understood. I'm gonna get there.
Okay.
I can jump ahead if you would like.
No, I
I
just,
totally understand.
no, I'm trying to understand the picture, and if you're gonna get there,
Gonna get
I
there.
should shut my mouth.
It's okay.
Or just wait quiet.
I have trouble waiting quiet.
You ask any questions.
Exactly.
I'm just trying to understand.
Well,
So we'll get there, I promise. So in terms of Vermont employment and in Vermont sales, again, this is 2017 data, but we had $14 billion in sales in Vermont, and we had over 61,000 Vermonters that are employed in the food system in some way. So we are a small blip in that 61,000 out of 1 million employed across the whole 6 states, but we're mighty. And our food system, the value of our food system has been growing steadily. So, when you think about other types of sectors, the food system competes very well in terms of overall impact on our communities and our state. So this actually gives you a snapshot of, like, again, we know how small we are, but what this basically is showing is in Vermont, we have 4.3% of the population, we have 6.1% of the food system jobs, and we have 7.5% of all the food system sales. So Massachusetts, as we know, is the largest population, it is the largest food system jobs, and it has the largest food system sales. So this really is this shouldn't be a surprise in terms of how this spreads out, but it's just to give a relative sense of sort of where do we fit in all of this.
so we're pretty small.
We're small, but as you will see,
Like
we
I
are
was
mighty.
telling you earlier today in a different discussion.
Yeah, okay. So when we think about jobs, while we have over 61,000 jobs, the multiplier effect of that, sort of the parts and pieces of additional jobs, these 61,000 is direct jobs in the food system, but then that spins off another 0.8 jobs. So we often think about that in terms of different economic sectors, but the food system employment impact overall is over 108,000 jobs. So you think about accountants and bankers and agency of ag staff and UVM extension staff, all of these different folks that a portion of their work relates to the food system, marketing people, sales people, they're not maybe 100%, so they're part of that overall. Again, just relative size. All right, so now we're jumping into eating patterns, because this is what is so critical to understand to then get to Senator Wester, your question about how then are we going to how much are we currently producing, and how are we going to actually feed people? So we needed to establish some assumptions about what are we currently eating and how might we need to eat differently if we're actually going to achieve that 30%. Okay, so that's where we're going. So just to level set on how we defined what is resilient eating, right? Because resilience is our ability to bounce back. It's our ability to adapt and adjust when climatic things happen to us. We're putting in bigger culverts so that we can handle more rain. That's a form of resilience. So how does that apply to eating, right? It's an important element in overall regional food system resilience overall, but resilience goes beyond increased regional self-reliance in production of healthy food by sustainable methods, because it really is about how do we produce enough food so that we can ensure food security for everyone, not just those who can afford it, but it really has to be for everyone. So it's looking at how do we eat healthier, how do we improve access to that food, how do we get more food and nutrition security to happen, and how do we support the local and regional businesses so that they can be thriving, and how do we reduce the vulnerability that individuals, and it's doing vulnerability for individuals, so that we're also then increasing community food security and connectivity. So what we did was we took a look at how are we eating today, and what's on the left is the pie chart of basically our current caloric intake for most adults. It's about 2,700 calories a day without alcohol. You can see how it's split up between grains and meat, 612 calories with meat, 550 with added fats, oils, and butter, 363 calories from sugars, etc. Only 206 calories from vegetables, 90 calories from fruit. This is how we currently eat, generally speaking. Now, each individual, like Senator, you might eat, 3/4 of your plate might be vegetables.
Not
But-
usually.
But this is generally how we're eating today. So we started there because when we modeled this, we modeled like, well, if we didn't change how we ate, how much food would need to be produced? And then we said, okay, well, if we're gonna eat in a healthier, more resilient way that's connected a little bit more to what we could actually produce in the region and is connected to adapting to climate change, then we would need to be more around 2,300 calories. Now, interestingly, the USDA Dietary Guidelines of America actually says that we should be trying to be more like 2,300 calories a day for the average adult. So we came in pretty close with our assumptions. Our caloric ratios are a little bit different than what the USDA Dietary Guidelines are, but generally speaking, you can see what the change would mean in terms of calories. It would be more on the grains, a little less on meat, a little bit, definitely more on vegetables, more on fruit, about the same on, actually the same on dairy, different percentage ratio, but the same caloric intake, what we would look for. So here's how it would actually play out. This may be a little hard to read, but basically it would be about going from 0.8 cups of fruit a day up to 2 cups a day, 1.9 cups of vegetables up to 3 cups a day. Kept dairy the same, proteins would drop just a little bit, but it would be a little bit more heavy on the seafood, nuts, beans side of things, and more grass-based meats, and about the same on grains, sweeteners, and fats and oils. So, yes, please.
So, quick question. So will this, the 2030, will this also sort of accompany eating campaign shift? Is that what you're proposing, that now the New England states will say, we really need you, the American people, to eat a different way?
We hope that's what will happen. I mean,
Okay.
I think one of the challenges that we identified in the common challenges was that how difficult it's been to try to inform and influence people's diets over time. So it would be a big lift, right? This is by no means a walk in the park.
And is this success contingent upon people eating this way?
No,
Okay,
I'll
okay.
but it will mean more land.
So I
So,
agree with you, it's hard to get
Really
people
hard.
to shift
And-
how they eat.
and just to be clear, this is not trying to be prescriptive, like you have to eat a cup a day of broccoli and you need to eat. Saying just broadly vegetables, broadly fruit. You can
Sure.
choose what types and kinds that you like and want. Yes, sir.
So I want to follow up Senator Campion's point, because when someone says to me, healthy eating, I go, nope, not for me. Because I'm thinking I'm gonna eat spinach and kale
Yeah.
till it's coming out of my ears. So I do think there's an issue about convincing people, making them want to eat differently.
Yeah.
I think producing more, I get that. I
Yeah.
understand
Yeah.
that we can plant more stuff and raise more animals, that we can get to the 30%.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure you're gonna be able to make people want to eat this way.
Fair
because-
enough. I mean, I think that's the part of the work here, and it won't be something that everybody's can do. But our hope is that by presenting this and say, look, what would it take for you to go from, say, 2 cups of vegetables a day to 3 cups of vegetables? Is that possible or not? Like sometimes just breaking it down to making it so that it's not just like eat healthier. You know, it's a little bit more information about like, oh, well, you don't have to change your dairy consumption. You know, you can keep that about the same. And with proteins, you know, maybe add in a few more nuts and maybe have, you know, fish once a week or something like that. Like all of those types of things together could actually help someone get closer to this without them even realizing it, really. When you're not counting calories, for instance.
Yeah, okay.
As long as there's enough cheese on broccoli, I don't have a
Right.
And I love cheese.
I do too. That's good. All right, so now we're gonna get into the production. This is gonna get at some of the land questions about what it's really gonna take. So this was in volume 2 where we estimated the production of what it would take to get to 30% regional self-reliance. So again, we started with the diet because we needed to have some assumptions of like, oh, okay, well, if we're gonna have this amount of vegetables that are needed, how many acres are gonna be needed to produce those vegetables? If we're gonna have dairy about the same, how many acres is that and how would that stay the same or change a little bit, right? So these two things really go together. And part of what we did, just so you know, we had 10 focus groups that we held with producers and people that are in the case of wild capture fisheries. We also had a harvesting and marketing group. So we held some focus groups to test our assumptions and our thinking about this, and to look at some of the data to get a sense of like, are we just blowing smoke here, or like what would it really take, and what are some of the challenges that producers face in order to get to this level of consumption. So when we start with the population, right? If we're gonna answer the question of how might we get to 30% regional food self-reliance, we have to know, well, where's the population live? Where's the ag land? Where is food manufactured, and how do we then start to think about moving food from where it's produced to where it's consumed? So this slide here should not be any type of new information to you. We all know the population is primarily in the southern part of New England, right? You take a look up in northern Maine, some of those largest counties up there, the largest, most north ones, Aroostook County, are some of the biggest ag producers in the region, for instance. So if you take a look at population, one of the questions that we hold is like, well, what would it actually take for folks that live in southern New England to care about where their food comes from the northern New England states? And could they actually start to care more about farmers and fishers and food manufacturers in the northern part of the state? And how might farmers, fishers, food manufacturers in the northern parts of the state really understand the relationship to helping to feed where the bulk of the population centers are in southern New England? Like, how do we actually start to think more like a region and think about production and the movement of food across our states more like in this, more from a regional mindset? Okay. Good. So here's what we currently are producing as a region as a whole. This is across the 6 states. Fisheries, we don't think about this because we don't have any oceans, but fisheries is actually the largest piece. And to Senator Westman's point, it's also, it doesn't show it here, but the vast majority of what we catch leaves the region, right? In dairy, we're at 16%, which is largely Vermont, and a lot of our dairy leaves the region.
So if we eat more cheese and yogurt and more fish, we can get to the 30%.
Exactly.
The problem is that both of those end up being more expensive for glory.
Which is where that's why we have to take a really balanced approach here, right? Which we actually haven't had a more balanced approach. You think about it, we have gone where we could do production and where we could export. And that has been our focus. We're gonna grow the parts of the production base that we can grow a lot, and we're gonna sell as much as we can. We don't really care where it's sold. And what we're saying is, what if we actually cared about some of this a little bit more and thought about more intentionally about retaining some more of what we produce in the region for regional consumption and not export it outside the region? What could that look like? So you can see vegetables, we're only producing 11% of everything that's produced sales-wise is vegetables. Now vegetables are don't command as much. You know, a case of broccoli is not equivalent to 100 weight of milk, right, in the marketplace. So that's part of what this is showing is from a sales perspective where the relative value of things. Now, on the food manufacturing side, again, a very diverse array of products, from animal food and grain milling to bakeries to beverages, obviously, fluid milk, seafood products, some vegetable and fruit processing, other dairy products, animal, livestock slaughter. So these, we have a diverse array of things that we can produce in the region, that are being produced in the region. And again, the question is, of what is being currently produced, what more could we be doing, and how could we be retaining more of what we're producing for consumption in the region?
So, like fluid milk,
Yeah.
9%. What does that mean?
That means that the sales of the overall mix of everything that we're buying across all products, not fluid milk represents 9% of those total sales dollars. Other dairy products are another 6%. So of all what we're spending on food, that's, to take $1.
15%.
I'll show you that. I've got a better slide to show you that.
Are those in here?
These two slides, that's a good question. Yes. Oh no. No, they are not. Sorry. They are not. They are in volume 2. So how are we doing as a region with what we're producing? This is by pounds, what I'm showing you here. And what we wanted to do was to get to a calculation of regional self-reliance. And what regional self-reliance simply means is what is being produced in the region, what is being consumed in the region, regardless of, well, let me start this. What are we producing in the region, regardless of where it actually is sold, meaning is it consumed in the region or not, divided by total consumption of all food, regardless of where it comes from. So what this means is you take a look at what is being produced by pounds in the region. We are 44.6% regionally self-reliant on dairy products. Now, remember, we export out of the region a lot of dairy, so that does not mean that we're producing and consuming 44.6% of all of, right? We're just saying we're producing a lot, we're consuming a lot, but and it's relative to all the other food groups. So we are most self-reliant as a region based on dairy. Okay? Vegetables, we're at 31.7%.
We're still ahead.
Right, so if you're thinking about that 30% marker, right? What we're saying is we're producing more dairy than what we actually need in terms of getting to 30%. But we're a long way off on fruits, on other types of proteins, grains, and other things that we could produce here, right? These are all ratios to each other. But let me show you where this then goes. That vegetables are 31.7%. 82.3% of that is starchy vegetables, most of which is potatoes from Maine. So what this slide
Worcester
tells me
County.
is, so what this slide tells me is, we have a huge opportunity to expand our vegetable production across a variety of products that we actually consume here in the region, but mostly it comes from away. It comes from Central Valley, California, it comes from Mexico, it comes from Florida, wherever it's coming from. Right? And then when you take a look at on proteins, 4.1%, look at this, 31.8% is coming from seafood. 19% from eggs, 10% from lamb, only 5% from beef, 0.1% from chicken. Again, when I see this, what this represents for me is an opportunity to be able to produce more of these products for consumption in our region rather than importing them. Because this is saying that we're producing these things, but but a lot of it, in the case of seafood, most of it is exported.
Okay, thanks. So do we have a sense of if that small percentage of turkey is being produced here in New England, what the demand for turkey is in New England? I mean,
Don't
aside
know.
from the holidays?
We don't know.
Okay,
I mean, there may be
So
data
that
sets
could
out
mean-
there,
okay,
but yeah, we didn't look at that question specifically.
I see, okay. Thank you.
Yeah, so then what we did, so remember what I just showed you was pounds.
Yep.
We as consumers, we don't tend to think in terms of pounds. You don't think about like, oh, I'm gonna have a half a pound of chicken today, right? You think about serving sizes and you think about calories. So we had to do some then translating pounds to servings and calories to try to get at, well, if we were to take a look at our production of dairy and vegetables by serving size, what is our relative regional self-reliance by those? By servings, we're 50% self-reliant on dairy products. We're 28% self-reliant in vegetables. Only 3.2% on protein, right? So again, what this is giving us a sense of is the level of effort we're going to need to get to 30%. It's not that we need every one of these food groups to get to 30%, right? The mix in total needs to get to 30%. So, but if what we're primarily producing by serving size is dairy, then there's a couple of options. We need to either reduce overall dairy production and consumption by some amount and replace it with something else, or more dairy needs to leave the region and we need to increase of these other types of food groups. Like it's a balance, right? And there's no one thing to draw a conclusion to other than there's an awful lot of what we consume that we could be producing if we spent more focused energy on doing that. Because we've done it for dairy and we've done it for seafood, we can do it for other things. Right? So here's the big one. What would the land base take? So what this shows up here, this colored box at the top, that represents what our current land and agriculture is across the 6 states. And you can see how it's broken up between perennial forages, pasture, ungrazed, 400,000 in pasture cover that's ungrazed. You have a little over 287,000 acres in permanent pasture. You have 191 in feed crops. There's 168,000 acres in idle cropland is what our estimate is. You take a look at 160 across the 6 states, 161,000 acres in idle cropland. And this is in the executive summary, this one is in there.
So would you define that?
Idle cropland?
Just, it's there, it could be used.
Yep, could be
It's just
used.
not.
Yep. On page 24, if you wanted to take a look at it more closer to read.
Do we know why, Mr. Chairman?
Yeah.
Do we know why?
Some of it could be that it's uneconomical. Some of it's there's just a lack of enough farmers to utilize the land. It could be that the land maybe wasn't quite as productive as it could be, and it's been led to go back into brush hogging, for instance, some of it's returning to forests. It's a whole range
Yeah,
of things.
sure.
Could be parcelization. It's hard to, like, there's not enough sort of critical mass of farmland in an area, so having the ability to actually work the land becomes harder because there's so many houses around it. It could be a whole bunch of different things.
Thank you.
But I think the takeaway from this is vegetables across the state region is only 97,511 acres. It's really not that much land in vegetables. 73,000 acres in fruit.
Is that 400,000, is that what we're utilizing at the present time? Total?
The pasture cover ungrazed.
All for growing.
Yeah, to get to 30% regional production, we would need to improve 400,000 acres of existing but underutilized cropland. So that's where, like, that extra little bump out there, if you go down to the lower one, that expanded amount is what it would take to get to 30% regional self-reliance. So going from 2 million acres in production to 2.6 million acres in production. So where would that land come from? Some of it is using the idle land, underutilized land, getting that back into better production. And some of it is actually probably re-clearing some of what happened farms that has started to go back to forests to get into production. But it also means shifting some of the land and what is being produced on it. So it would be, because we would be doing more grass-based livestock, you'd want to actually increase feed crops and some of the grazed pastures. You'd want to increase vegetable production to 235,000 acres. Again, this is a model based on the diets, run through what it is we currently produce, and then estimating out, well, what would it take if we really were to have a mix of products that we could actually produce here, that we have the soils for it, we have the production know-how, what would it look like if we were to get to 30%? This is one scenario of the expanded acreage that would be needed in order to achieve 30%. So for me, the takeaway from that, from a public policy perspective is how do we accelerate the securing of the agricultural land base, right? How do we get more farmland permanently protected as farmland? How do we prioritize farmland as a viable land use that we want to ensure continues in the future and actually expands, right? Because you change that farmland into housing or some other kind of development, that farmland's gone forever, right? So how, as a society, from a public policy perspective, might we want to think about the prioritization, the relative prioritization of farmland as we think about land being finite, we think about all the other uses for land, where does agriculture and food production fit in the mix? These are sort of big existential questions for us. And, the conversations that you're having this session about housing and Act 250 and the 30 by 30 biodiversity planning and all of those things, and forest land usage and protecting a forest, all of those things are in play. And we want to make sure that we don't forget how important it is to maintain our agricultural lands for food production. I'm not going to go there. So if you take a look at land in Vermont, I found looking at this graphic really quite something. It's actually in your Vermont state brief if you want to look at it a little bit more closely on a little farther way in there. You could see it probably a little bit better. So we have this is for the region as a whole. So then how does Vermont look Well, most of our land is, and you probably know this, most of our land, 93.6% is in forage and corn silage as animal feed. Right?
Okay.
So vegetables, we have 3,317 acres in vegetables in the state.
Say that again?
3,317 acres of vegetables. Right? We have 662 in berries. We have 2,800 in orchards. So when you think about, again, Vermont's role as a major agricultural producer for the region, granted we have a small land base, right? But we have a lot of agricultural activity. And most of that agricultural activity is used for animal feed. So I'm not saying that we are looking to get rid of dairy. That's not the situation. But as dairy continues to transition, what happens to those acres that come out of dairy production, right? Does it just go into more forage and corn silage for another dairy farmer to add more cows, which we may or may not really need at this point? Or could it be transitioned to other diversified livestock like cattle production, chicken production, for those types of products that we talked about already, that we know we want to eat and that we do eat and that we could be producing here, right? More into vegetable production. How could some of those land, some of the most fertile land in the state that is currently in continuous corn and continuous hay, some percentage of that go into vegetable production, for instance?
A lot of the small farms have reverted back to buckabush.
Exactly.
And,
Yeah.
you know, the farms that go out with 100 cows, maybe.
Yeah.
I believe, I don't know if you have any of that info or not at the agency, but what I see is the bigger farms, the 18, 15 to 3,000 cows, they'll pick up that
Yeah.
land.
Exactly.
But they won't buy those 30 to 50 cow farms because the fields are too little for their equipment to be efficient.
Yeah.
And
it's pasture
it grows up to
land. Yeah, the pasture land,
brush.
the pasture land for all of this grows up.
So from a public policy perspective, the question is, how do we support beginning BIPOC, other types of farmers to be able to get onto that land so it doesn't go to buckabush? That if it's not going to be used for feed for the dairy industry, how do we make it more affordable and get more people actually using that land, producing food for human consumption?
I'm going to say something unpopular with land with development rights. Those small farmers can't afford it. We're watching land that the development rights have gone selling per acre for 8,000 to 10,000.
Yeah. No, it's a problem. It's
And
something
no
we're gonna
small
address.
farmer can do that,
Yeah.
and the large farmers can do that, and the large farmers don't use pasture. They all warehouse the cattle in large barns, and only want the cropland, and the cropland is where you would raise vegetables. You wouldn't raise vegetables on my pasture.
But once it's all grown up, by the time you get that cleared back off,
I'm struggling with that. Well, it's not only that, but in that pasture land, we sold the cows between 8 and 9 years ago. Our fences have gone to pieces.
Yeah.
I will have, over the course, by the time I'm through, over the course of 3.5 years, to replace the fences, I'll spend $65,000 on fences.
and is it worth it? Is the return worth it or not worth it?
Right, well, that's the huge question. I have a sentimental value for it, not having it all grow up.
Right, but from a public policy perspective, that these are some of the big questions that have to get thought through. What are we really wanting to prioritize, right? So here's some data that American Farmland Trust did an analysis across the US around projected changes in land and agriculture. And if nothing else changes in our land use patterns, if land keeps getting converted from farmland to other uses the way that it has been historically, Vermont is on track by 2040 to lose another 41,200 acres of farmland to other forms of development. So again, I'm kind of painting a dire picture here, but like this is just what the data is. This is just showing where there are development pressures on existing farmland. So as we were saying in a few slides before, that we're trying to increase production, the trend data is that we're reducing available farmland based on the historic trends of land use in our state. And this is replicated in other places, probably more accelerated in places like Massachusetts and such. So to Senator Westman's question on land values, this is from August of 2022.
I want to correct that. That's not a question.
Yes.
It's a statement of what I've seen.
Yes. Yes.
And
Sorry. Yes.
in areas around where I live.
Yeah, and so this is an average across the states. So it's going to be different in different counties and different localities, but the average. You think about trying to get farmland in Rhode Island, 17,500 an acre. Even in Massachusetts, 15,200 an acre. Maine is down at 2,860 an acre. Now, again, in certain parts of their state, it would be drastically higher than that. But in Vermont, 4,200 an acre of farmland.
And that was 2022.
Yeah.
Then through COVID, all of it's gone crazy.
So, yeah, if you can go back, Ellen, well, I can just read it here. So AFT projects Addison, Franklin, and Rutland counties will experience the biggest decreases of inland and agriculture.
Yes.
So my question is, does that mean that there's more development in those three counties? And that's why land is not being used because I don't see that development in Rutland County very much.
I think they were looking at historical trends. It could be just other forms of use. So, or it could be that land is taken out of agriculture. It's just nothing's happening on that particular land. It's not in production anymore.
And I understand the situation in dairy where there's fewer farms, but larger farms.
Yes.
And I guess that's true in my county too, to some degree, although it's probably more true in Franklin and Addison. But so I'm just trying to figure out,
Sure.
It seems like everybody's anti-development, and yet I don't see a lot of development in Rutland County. I know there aren't big apartment buildings and houses being built on every block.
Right.
So that isn't taking the land out of agriculture.
No, it's taking existing ag land, which in the case of Rutland County is going to be in the more rural areas. And are you seeing more parcels being broken up for houses, for instance, or farms that are just going out and they're not then transitioning that to the next generation?
I think the latter more so.
Yeah.
I think Richie mentioned it earlier. If they sold their development rights, that land has to stay in some form of ag. And we've got VHCB coming in, asking them about this, but they've been buying the rights of first refusal. And now the farmer, say if you come along and you're from Boston, you say, well, I'm the farmer and I've got 50 acres. You'll say, well, yeah, I'll continue to farm. I'll grow 10 beef and 50 chickens. Well, now they're coming in from PHCD saying, well, and paying me, the farmer, good money for that property. They're saying, well, we'll offer, we want to take our first offer off because they have the right to first refusal and offer them farm value, strictly farm value for that property, whereas the guy from Boston will pay maybe double in some cases what, for his type of farming he'll do if he buys the whole property. So we gotta have a
Well, one of,
discussion.
in the current use program, if it's not in, separate out those that where the development rights are. What we've been seeing for at least the last 15 years is those lands that are in current use. The farm goes out, if the farm isn't concerned, a lot of people will develop, sell off 27 or 28 acre lots. And you put the house in 2 acres out of current use, the rest of the 25 all stays in current use. It increases the price of the current use program. A lot of your pasture land ends up going like that for these farms. What we've created is a situation where people get protection around their house, but it's not in farming anymore. But as long as it's more than 25 acres and you have 2 extra acres for a house site, you can stay in current use. And that's happening all over the place.
Woodstock.
Oh, Woodstock a number of years has been the number 1 town where the applications to be in current use were. And you can't tell me it all was staying in agriculture.
Yeah. Exactly. No, I mean, these are the big public policy questions to be wrestling with right now, right? Another one is around our overall, we've been sort of touching on this throughout here of our agricultural sales. One of the questions that we ask a lot in Farm to Plate is, well, if dairy and cattle and milk are 59.2% of all sales, but only 9.5% of all farms, and we look at some of these other products that we can produce here, like maple, for instance, obviously, cattle, vegetables, fruit, poultry and eggs, other types of animals. From a planning perspective, what would it take for maple to double in sales? What would it take for beef cattle to double in sales, to go from a $57 million industry to a $100 million industry, for instance? What would it take for our current 27 million in vegetables to become a $50 million industry? Like, to me, that gets me excited about thinking about, well, what would that actually take in terms of our grant programs at the state?
Could you just say vegetables, the total value? Is that
27 million.
for Vermont?
Yes, this is Vermont sales here. Yeah, we're at 27 million in total vegetable sales.
And we do that on 3,300 acres. So should be some money in veggies. No. Yeah, Brian?
But I think it goes back to my earlier question, what is the demand? That's really hard, because you want, I guess every small businesswoman can go and do their own assessment, but if we could show them, people really want local turkeys off season,
Right.
when it's not the holidays or all of these things.
That's part of it, yes.
Mm-hmm.
And as we'll get into talking about market channels, there's also barriers to actually getting Vermont food into the places where most people shop, which is grocery stores. So again, same kind of thing is around farms. We have the most number of farms are just doing hay. Interesting, again, there's no reason to put a value judgment on this. It's just like, this is just how it is. But the question going forward is, where do we want to concentrate? Where do we want to prioritize? where could state level grant programs be directed towards? If we were to really say, we wanna help get to 30% as a region, we think there's opportunity for our farmers and food producers, how might that inform what we prioritize from a public policy perspective? You all know this is a scary data graph of demographics of New England farmers. You know, like the sheer number of people coming up between less than 25 years old and say 54, that number there in those first 4 bars is smaller than the next 3 bars in aggregate. So we have, you know, we've been talking about this for years, and we haven't got any kind of a solution, simple solution here. You know, it goes back to getting more young people interested in careers in agriculture.
Well, no young person is going to go into agriculture if they aren't already in a family or kind of hooked up with a corporation. That in the big dairy farms, if what you're going to ask is that they pay $8,000 an acre, right? And they can't afford the equipment, anything to go into that.
Yep.
So if you're going to increase that number, what you're talking about is small farmers like, and I'll use in my area, the Hooters and Johnson, doing what they do. You have to figure out a way to economically either help them do it, or we have to do something different for that group of people. Because you're never going to see those numbers on the lower end grow. They're priced out of the business economics.
It's hard to believe we've got basically 5,500 farms that they're still farming at over 75 years old.
Yeah, no, I know.
I mean,
Yeah, that's across the New England. That's not just Vermont.
that's all.
Yeah, but still.
Yeah, but it's the largest cohort, if you take a look at the last page, 61% increase in people 80 and over.
80 and
Yeah.
I mean,
And that also speaks to the economics of some forms of production that make it hard for people to retire, right? Because their land is their retirement. If they don't want to sell their land and they don't have somebody to succeed them. So it just means that from a going forward, we have to think more creatively about how do we get first generation type folks onto farms? How do we get more BIPOC and immigrant families onto farms? How do we help get more young people interested in careers, going to BTSU Randolph campus to the new center when that reopens? You know, how do we get more people, young people wanting to do this?
So we're in a second generation, and you just brought up their equity is within their land, and I absolutely agree with that. But you have a bunch of people in that generation now that is in their 70s and 80s that 25 years ago probably sold or might have sold their development rights. And now you have land that they purchased for well less than $1,000 an acre that's now selling for $10,000 an acre. I've heard as much, one farm in Franklin County going for $11,000 an acre. No young farmer can afford that, and you've already purchased the developer rights.
even a big farm can't afford that.
But they're paying it, somebody's paying it, and nationally you've got, who is it, Bill Gates, who's out buying farmland all over the country.
Was the largest landowner in the United States.
In the United States.
So, to Senator Westman's point about other people coming in and buying things up, I see it in my own community buying small businesses. We used to have a local undertaker that's been purchased by a national corporation. We used to have 2 veterinarian offices, both bought by local corporations. Is that happening out there where we are now going to become, somebody's going to recognize the need and just some corporation's gonna buy up the land?
Well, you are seeing more equity firms around the country buying up farmland as an investment, right? So that is definitely a dangerous trend. I think that the challenge, of course, is that it's one of those things we don't really track. So it happens parcel by parcel by parcel by parcel, and all of a sudden you wake up 5 years, 10 years later, and a whole chunk of land is just gone. And we don't, because we're not tracking it, we're not paying attention to it. So I think it, again, is one of those things that we're gonna have to wrestle with.
You don't, you don't track that, do you?
Be hard to.
Cause I know up my way in Franklin County, there's a equity company that buys up or buys into
Yeah.
a lot of farms that,
It's
you
an
know
investment.
what's gonna happen.
It's an investment.
Eventually, they're gonna take over.
But that is something that would be valuable to be tracking, to get a better a handle on, right? I mean, it would just be looking at land transfer stuff. Anyways, I'm concerned about, a little bit concerned about time, because we wanna talk about markets, and I wanna make sure Abby has enough time. So in volume 4, we looked at market channels and food expenditure. So what are we actually spending our money on? And in 2021, the average household spent 12.4% of their income on food. So you think about it from the standpoint of like, that's the size of the consumer dollar pie that we wanna try to get 30% of that going to regional and local food. Right? That makes sense? Most people are spending the most amount of money on things like housing, transportation, then food, then personal insurance, then healthcare, right? So
You got the whole list.
yeah, yes, down the side there, right? So if you think about it from like food is, I mean, everyone's gotta eat, right? It's a big part of what we spend our dollars on every month.
That's still, that's not a bad number.
Right,
It could be higher and still be a damn good number.
sure. There's other things, you know, that we might prioritize that or have less priority on that are being spent. Like this is the total population. This is about how much we're spending on food. It's different also by race. Interestingly, Asian folks tend to spend more on food. That's what they prioritize, right? And whereas African Americans have less overall income to work with, and so they're spending about $6,100. You can see what the average annual expenditure is. So Asians are in general are earning the most and they're spending the most on food. Then Caucasian white folks, 71,000 a year annual expenditure, spending 8,700 on food. So you can just sort of get a sense of, from a ratio standpoint. And then under these food at home,
I'm
like
sorry,
how does this?
Sure, so you said earning the most, but I see average annual expenditure.
I'm sorry. Yes, I'm sorry. I misspoke. Yeah, how that people are actually spending the dollars
so
that they
let me
have. Yes, on these different categories. So of food, then underneath that is food at home and food away from home. I think this will show it a little bit easier, although you might find this difficult to read. But basically, what I'll explain is the average in the Northeast, the average expenditure. Consumers are spending about 34% of their dollars on food. They're spending away from home. They're going to restaurants, for instance, right? They're spending 56.6% at home.
34%, that's a lot.
Well, it's because of Massachusetts and New York. This is Northeast numbers. So our numbers in Vermont are not that same ratio. We're way more at the food at home. But what's interesting about this, is that this column here, this $1,500 a year, is miscellaneous food, sugars, fats, sweets. So of what we're spending, what we're going out and we're buying at stores to bring into our homes to produce, $1,500 of that is things like frozen prepared meals, canned food, chips, desserts, condiments, candies, sweets, those kinds of things. About 1,300 is protein, it's meat, right? So we're spending about $314 on beef, $237 a year on pork, $226 on poultry, right? So again, break this down, right? From an opportunity standpoint, how do we capture more of the dollars for products that we could actually be producing here that consumers are buying, but they're not being given the opportunity in many cases to purchase from Vermont or other New England producers.
Hey, that slide shows me that people love their junk.
And which correlates back to challenges with nutrition and health and obesity and all those things, right? All these things interconnect, right?
Yeah.
So fresh fruits and vegetables, we're spending about $647 a year on average on fruits and on vegetables, 619 on fruit. Again, 583 on dairy products. Again, what would we need to do and change going forward if we wanted to capture more of these consumer dollars? To me, this is a hopeful slide because it gives me like, oh, there's some things we could actually do to try to intervene and orient folks more towards the kinds of things that we're actually able to produce in Vermont. So what does that actually mean in terms of your 30% number? Some of this interestingly, it doesn't feel like so huge in some regards, because on average per capita, we're spending, as we mentioned, we're spending a lot of money overall on $13.2 billion. I'm sorry, $7.6 billion directly on food right now across the 6 states. 30% of that is, wait, no, I'm saying this all wrong. I don't have it on this slide actually. We have 89 billion in sales. So what these numbers are is showing that 30% per capita this is the dollar amount that we would spend on regional food if we were to get to 30 of what 30% represents. So somewhere between 1,100 at the low end to 1,890 at the high end, which doesn't mean we're spending more on food. We're saying we're shifting.
Instead of buying that potato chips, you might be.
Exactly. So what it shows is the bottom numbers there is like we would, from a sales perspective, if we shifted to 30%, we'd be going from 7.6 billion spent on food. Currently, the low estimate side could be as much as 13.2 billion. Like there's economic activity to be gained by moving in this direction for the region, for our producers. So in Vermont, what that looks like is somewhere between getting Vermonters to spend somewhere between $1,100 and $1,900 a year on local or regional food. Like that, to me, that doesn't seem like too big a lift. Not for everybody, obviously. People with really low incomes, it's going to be harder, and we want this to be something that's available to everybody. But it's still, when I saw these numbers calculated this way, I was like, that does feel a little bit more achievable if we're thinking about people just learning more about where their food comes from and making intentional choices. I spent a little time looking at how food moves. I'm not going to go into that because you know that this gets to the question that you all had about how do we get more local and regional food in front of people so they have the ability to make that choice. $85 billion in sales, and $42 billion is coming out of Massachusetts. Sales is in Massachusetts, and of that, 17.8 billion is supermarkets. I mean, it's just like the magnitude of across the region of the different market channels across the 6 states. Vermont is down in the lowermost right-hand bottom at $3.3 billion in sales, and 1.8 billion of that is coming from being sold in supermarkets. This is a better, easier to see for Vermont numbers. But you think about 56% of what Vermonters are going out buying food. Where are they buying it? They're buying it from grocery stores, from supermarkets. So how do we get more local and regional food into those markets in order to be able to make it more possible for consumers to be consuming that food? So you can see direct markets is 52 0.8 billion. So direct sales are farmers markets, CSAs, farm stands. It's only 1.6% of total sales is coming from that channel.
Right.
Thank you, sure. Is there something, is there a reason the Hannafords and others say no? Is there legislation? Because periodically I walk into a grocery store and says, here's a basket of local stuff, or
Yeah.
this might, they call it local, but it's from Maine.
Yeah.
What is that sort of block?
A lot of it is structural. It is when you think about the supermarkets, they're not really in the business of food anymore. They're in the business of real estate on their shelves. So they charge producers for the benefit, for the opportunity to put your product on their shelf. That's what they're really selling, right? So when you think about so if you're an independent store, we have in Vermont, this is Vermont data, we have over 100 independently owned grocery stores. Those are locally owned. The person that owns the store lives in the region, lives in the town. They're more responsive because they know the customers.
Sure.
We're having much greater ability to get local products into our independently owned grocery stores in Vermont because of the fact that we can work with them. We have a retail grocers training program that we offer, for instance. Trying to get into, it's virtually impossible to get into Dollar General, Dollar Trees, except maybe with milk. Hannaford, Shaw's, Price Chopper, it's difficult because they are really, they either own their own distribution or they have distributors that require them to source certain quantities of food into their stores. So we did a really good deep dive into what are all the different stores that exist that we can start to understand what would it take to get more product into those stores. We know we've done a lot of really good work with getting into restaurants. We can do more. We've really worked hard at getting into institutions. The reality is though that institutional sales represent a small percentage of food and beverage sales. About 25% of the population spends time in those institutions every day. So it is an opportunity to get more local or regional food in front of and get consumed by people. And I'm gonna jump to this. So Senator Westman, you asked early on, where are we at? So we are at 16% of local food consumption in 2020. And we know in Vermont where those sales are happening across stores or direct sales, restaurants, those kinds of things. So I'm hopeful that by the end of the session we might have a graphic to show across the other 5 states where we're at with these kinds of sales.
Just one question.
Yeah.
In your back thing, is liquor considered food?
We do in our sales numbers, we do have locally produced beverages as part of that percentage, yes. It ends up being about
Well, you
3
had
or
one
4%,
in
something like
4%, and then bars was another. So I was.
Oh, I see
It
what you're
must be with the two of them about 5%.
Yeah.
And if you go back one more, you had alcohol sales.
You have liquor stores, you have bars on that chart, and I was just.
Yeah.
I don't think of liquor as food.
It's true. Yeah, what we do is when we do our count, we break out, we have the total, but then because it does represent jobs, it represents economic activity and some of the inputs.
I don't,
Yeah.
you don't need to spend a lot of time, it's just one.
Yeah. So what I'll just end with here is,
Yeah. You wanna have a martini for lunch.
Yeah.
what I'll just end here with is, when we put together then this Vermont brief, we asked Abby and her team and Farm to Plate crew, like what would Vermont priorities be in relation to helping to get towards this 30%? And so it's improved production, processing, distribution infrastructure, and supply chain investments. Abby's gonna talk a little bit about what we're doing on that front. It's cultivating viable wholesale grocery market opportunities within Vermont. We've got a grocers training program, but more can be done there. It's support and accelerate land access and land affordability, especially for beginning and socially disadvantaged BIPOC farmers. It's great synergies between climate policy and resilience and the food system. So it's not having these silos of like, oh, we're doing mitigation on flood control without also thinking about its impact on agriculture. And it's leveraging cross-sector coalitions to formulate more systemic solutions to food access and food security. So these are the kinds of priorities then that we're focusing on. Abby's doing such an amazing job at the agency, but then also within Farm to Plate and all the organizations that are Farm to Plate that are part of our network. You know, we see ourselves in Vermont as having an outsized role in producing more for the region, which means we have our producers have more economic opportunity in front of them to take advantage of regional markets as we expand, right? We also have a small population, so we can do our fair share of eating more regionally, but it's really gotta be people in Massachusetts and Connecticut and Rhode Island that are gonna carry the greatest weight in terms of eating more regionally if we're gonna hit 30%. Right, that's sort of the big high level takeaway that I would sort of leave you with is like, what are the policies and practices and funding opportunities that we as a state of Vermont have control over, and how do we want to apply them in this effort of having greater food security, meaning we're controlling more and we're securing more of the land base for agricultural production and keeping in agricultural production so that we're producing more of the foods that we all eat, producing it here and consuming it here. How does the changing landscape of what we're producing and consuming, what can we be pushing on to try to move forward on, whether that's land, the acreage costs, whether that's some of the issues around succession, whether that's in terms of funding for equipment, aggregation, distribution, lots of things we can be doing and we are doing. We're moving things in the right direction, but what this body of work tells me is we need to go farther, faster. We need more in this direction, that building on what we've laid the ground with over the last 15, 20 years.
And if we advance our vegetable growing, do we need more? Is that done by hand or is it done by equipment, the harvesting? You know, are we gonna need more like H2A workers, or is it equipment? Yeah, I don't know if you folks have looked into any of that to see what we're gonna, if we encourage and promote, say, vegetable growing,
Yep.
are we gonna need a structure behind them to crop that land?
Yep.
And all that?
Yeah. So let me turn it over to Abby. Thank you for
Yeah.
your time. Sorry that there was a lot here, I know.
Well, yeah, you gave us a whole load of hay. You're getting the chaff to sweep off.
Yeah, happy to play that role.
Yes.
Abby Willard, Agency of Agriculture, Food and Market.
She don't take the map, she didn't violate.
Yeah, Ellen does such a great job sharing all that data and research, the complexity of the issue, and where there's some real, I think, critical opportunity. So I can be really brief, but I want to just sort of recap the goal for a quick second. So if the goal is this regional self-reliancy that's achieved by increased food production and advancements in our distribution system, we're making movements in many of those directions, and that's really exciting. So both we're seeing state and federal resources directed in those areas, and we're sort of responding to what we saw during the pandemic, which was the value of local food, the fragility in the supply chain, and the challenge with consolidated production of food. So there is, as Ellen said, are these economic development opportunities, and I think our challenge and opportunity is like, how do we act upon them? How do we take advantage of this time? That I think is actually a very exciting opportunity for Vermont in agriculture. Despite all the challenges, this is also a really great opportunity. So in June of last year, Secretary Tebbetts and the other New England states all signed on to this plan and to this project and said, like, we're in, like, we get the opportunity, we see the challenges, but we're kind of like up to the opportunity. Which is actually pretty substantial sort of cross-state partnership and collaboration to sort of see everyone agree that this is sort of like a focus priority for our state agencies and departments of agriculture. I sit as a state partner along with Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund from the Vermont team that is part of this New England Feeding New England partnership. And so far, I'll just note, the relationship building that's happening across states is really critical. We're sharing information and best practices between Massachusetts and Connecticut and Vermont and Maine and others, which we didn't typically probably do as well as we should have. So that even just from a relationship building and collaboration perspective, this effort's meaningful. So the benefits, I think, that we see as a state that has 4% of the region's population, but 30% of the agricultural land is in the areas that you might expect. So we can increase production capacity, so we can grow more food in the state to both feed Vermonters and as an export commodity. We can support a strengthened distribution system. So we can build and be a part of seeing food both transported within the state and across the region, as well as the other supply chain infrastructure of storage and aggregation and processing. We already have producers that are looking to and are effective at producing products that are destined for markets outside of Vermont. So that's already like a trend in place, that Vermont producers already serve markets outside of Vermont. And we continue to maintain that brand that represents quality and value. And we know that folks across the Northeast region think of Vermont products as regional or even local to them. So like many of the parts and pieces are already in place for us to sort of kind of actualize this plan. And so part of that vision is focusing on infrastructure investments. So a lot of what you're talking about of like, if we wanted to see increased production in produce and fruits and vegetables, we would need infrastructure expansion to occur. So we know that we need equipment, we would need processing equipment for that industry to really grow and those sales to increase, as well as for those production jobs to grow. We will and need to focus on ensuring that our agricultural land and our open land stays available for food production. And, to some of the challenges around the cost of land, really look at some alternative land use and land access models. So it may not always be ownership. It may be, different ways for people to get on land and to begin or expand their food production practices, given the price of land and the challenges of development pressures and other land uses. In just 3 program examples, there's over $9 million in Vermont at the Agency of Agriculture focused on these economic development opportunities. So your body, as well as the General Assembly, supported the ag development grants for meat, maple, and produce. So that's the $2.3 million that's exactly designed to do what this is, which is grow the production in those 3 sectors. So we talked about meat and produce as like really essential and incredibly low level acres and but yet opportunity for increased sales, and the same with maple. So that diversification opportunity exists, whether you're a dairy operation that wants to add or transition to those sectors, or you already are producing those products and you want to grow your production. expand your production. The agency, we talked about this a little bit the other day, received these resilient food system infrastructure funding through US Department of Agriculture, so that's another $4.5 million that's on top of the 2.3, that's very specifically focused on how do we build support in the middle of the supply chain. So how do we see more value-added processing? How do we see more aggregation and movement of product and distribution within Vermont and across the region? So those funding opportunities will start in April, where we'll really see the opportunity for businesses to sign on to kind of help actualize this vision. And in addition, USDA developed these regional food business centers, and they invested $30 million in the Northeast, across the Northeast region. And so that's another, presumably $2 million that would come to Vermont that's focused on helping small and mid-scale businesses do more production and processing of Vermont product. So that's almost, and then on top of that, we have our Working Lands program and the specialty crop block work that we already do and the already established programs that we have. So you're looking at like $9 to $10 million of dollars currently available in Vermont that can be used to achieve many of the visions that's outlined in this plan. The challenge and the policy choices that we collectively have to make is like, do we want to see those resources continue to be appropriated in those ways? Do we see that it's not just a one-time opportunity to grow production and expanded land use, focus on ag products in Vermont? I think one piece that sort of gives me pause is adding 1 million acres to agricultural production in Vermont is a huge task. That would mean essentially doubling the amount of land that's currently in ag production in Vermont.
It's actually the region. This is 60 million acres.
No, the 1 million acres would be just in, if a majority of that were to happen in Vermont, right? If Maine and Vermont were kind of designed to be where there's land base that could be expanded for ag production, and a majority of that happened in our state, that would look like nearly a doubling of the amount of acres that we already have in ag production, which that is not a simple task to achieve, given land prices, given other development
If you're
pressures.
talking about 10,000 an acre for land that the development rates are already gone on, that's a 10 million, what you're spending now is 1,000 acres.
Right.
It would take me a long time to get to 1 million.
Well, it's all about money.
I know it's all about
You
money.
make money off the land by growing crops. You can't sell it for your products or you can't give your products away, and that's what's happening with that dairy. Little guys are getting $20 100 like they got 25 years ago. There isn't enough dollars there to make it go around.
Well, it's two things now. I think you're absolutely right on the dollars, but it's we don't have the labor force coming. If you look at that next generation, and you see those charts, we don't have the people coming to do the work, and because they can't. And I think part of it is the dollars they can't afford to get into. So, and it's like chasing your tail.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. So, we're still hung up on the demand side of things.
Mhm.
I don't think there's any question that we do a really good job with our maple. I mean, when you say it's real Vermont maple syrup, people understand what that means.
Yeah.
The dairy industry's done very well too with Cabot and Vermont, the fluid. And even the beverage, to Richie's point earlier about the alcohol, certainly craft beer has exploded, and people have a tendency to prefer a certain type, maybe from a certain state. But is there any way to measure what the New England, less Vermont, the other states in New England, what their demand is for products that might come from Vermont? Like, what makes our corn better than Massachusetts corn or New Hampshire corn. You see what I'm saying?
I do, and I think the question, there's a few ways, I think, to respond. One, it doesn't necessarily have to be a competition between Vermont and Massachusetts, but it could be a competition between New England and,
Midwest.
Okay.
you know, another country or other parts of this
Okay.
state, I mean, other parts of this country. And so knowing how much consumer choices are being made at a grocery store. When you go into a grocery store, all the corn that's being sold there is not from New England.
Sure.
Or even from the United States, whether you're talking in the fresh section or the frozen section or, you know, in the, you know, corn oil and like processed product category. So I think we've had to make some shifts, and we've spent the last 15 years talking about Vermont's food system and like buying locally and supporting Vermont, you know, producers and products. And this is like the next tier, which is, okay, we only have 4% of the region's population. We can't just rely upon Vermont's population to consume all the food that this state is capable of producing.
Right.
And so looking at those regional opportunities, the hope is that we're displacing product from other parts of the world as opposed to, you know, and replacing it with products grown regional.
Well, plus it would give other parts of the world the opportunity to feed the millions of people that are malnutritioned, and, you know, they may be closer to the people that are really hungry and could get rid of some of their products there, which would help these third world countries.
You can't do it if 10% of everything we do right now is farmers over 80 years old.
Agreed. I will say, I think both the
That's the
land
whole
and the
region.
age piece are of concern, and yet our agency still receives calls regularly from businesses or business owners wanting to move to Vermont to start a farm. People still want to come here and grow food. And sometimes the answer is, here's how we can create a, you know, an opportunity and a connection for you to access land or collaborate with another farmer that's looking for a transition or succession. And oftentimes we haven't been able to do that. And so those opportunities have been missed, or those individuals are still waiting for an opportunity to come to Vermont. So to me, that's where there's real opportunity in looking at what are some alternative land ownership relationships. What are ways that we can continue to encourage and invite new and beginning farmers to actually be able to move to Vermont and be part of growing food? And it may not mean, and most likely won't mean, that they're able to buy land at $10,000 an acre. And so are there other partnerships or other owners that they can collaborate with that may work? One project that we'll do this year is looking at the Act 250 on-site mitigation parcels that have been identified through development projects. All of those on-site mitigation parcels, they had to decide what area of that development project needed to be committed to agriculture permanently. What we don't know is, of those parcels, how many of them are currently in active agricultural production. The requirement is that it be available for agriculture, not necessarily that the landowner who did the development project is actively pursuing a farmer to farm that land. But our hope is that we can identify all those parcels across the state and then engage in more of a collaboration of, you know, communicating that that land is available and are there farmers that want to farm it. So that's one small example. I don't even know how many acres that's going to be. We won't know until we collect all the data in the coming months. But I think that's one small opportunity that could exist for some alternative land ownership, land access models.
See, we got, and we have Vita coming in tomorrow to see what part they're playing in all of this. And then we'll have Gus in to see where they are on all of this, to see how they're picking up the options of first refusal but in some cases the farmers really getting hosed on the deal, because what they could sell it for to the farmer I mentioned earlier is about half of what ag value is. So we're gonna figure all that out. With some of these small parcels, small farms, they're, people are looking for them, but not necessarily to raise chicken or pigs or, or to plant it all to veggies. Well, I think you guys have got a heavy lift ahead of you, and we're here to support this whole deal because I've been at it a long time trying to diversify and keep our ag land in ag. So anyways, it was really a good morning.
A little overwhelming, probably.
Yeah.
I'm gonna have Palomar, no, I think Camp can give us an overview of what you presented this morning.
You have to hear it 5 or 6 times to really.
Well, Eileen's gonna need some.
That's right, it's gonna need some kind of.
Yeah.
Yeah, true.
Thank you both
Yeah.
very much. And, if anytime we offer some assistance along the way, don't be shy. And Richie and I both sit on a different committee in the afternoon where some of the money is divided up. Is it all of it, Rich?
Well, we see a little bit.
Yeah, a little bit.
And this year it's getting
Skimpy.
It's the long game, for sure.
Yeah, well, thank you.
Yeah.